You may not realize it at first when your old identity begins losing its structure. It rarely announces itself in a dramatic way. More often, it appears as a strange instability in places that once felt familiar. The thoughts you used to rely on do not hold the same certainty. The reactions that once felt automatic begin slowing down, and the person you have been to yourself starts feeling less solid than before. This is what makes the identity gap so difficult to understand while it is happening, because it does not always feel like transformation at first. It often feels like the loss of internal continuity. Most people expect change to feel like progress in a clear direction. They imagine leaving one version of themselves and arriving quickly into another. But identity does not usually move that cleanly. There is often a period where the old structure is weakening before the new structure has enough coherence to feel natural. That middle space is the identity gap. It is the phase where the mind can no longer fully return to what it was, but has not yet learned how to live from what it is becoming. That gap forms because identity is not just a set of ideas about yourself. It is a lived system of interpretations, emotional habits, expectations, and familiar ways of making sense of reality. When something important changes in your understanding, the identity built on older assumptions cannot remain untouched. It begins losing authority. But the loss of authority does not immediately create a replacement. It creates space. And space, before it becomes meaningful, often feels unstable. You can notice this in simple ways if you watch your experience closely. Certain explanations about yourself stop feeling convincing, even if you can still repeat them. Old roles begin feeling too small, too forced, or strangely artificial. Patterns that once gave you a sense of certainty now feel like performances you can still enact but no longer fully believe. This does not mean you become confused in a shallow way. It often means something deeper has begun changing faster than your language for it. Most people assume this phase means they are lost. The spiral view reveals something more precise. They are not merely lost. They are in transition between structures of selfhood. That difference matters because if you interpret the gap as failure, you will rush to stabilize yourself with whatever feels familiar, even if it no longer fits. If you recognize it as transition, you can begin relating to the instability differently. This is where many people accidentally rebuild an old identity under a new name. They feel the discomfort of not knowing who they are, and they rush to close the gap as quickly as possible. They adopt a new label, a new certainty, a new explanation, and for a while this may feel like resolution. But often it is only a faster way of escaping the pressure of the in-between. The old need for solidity remains untouched, and so the new identity becomes another structure of protection rather than a true expression of deeper change. That is why the identity gap can be so revealing. It exposes not only what is dissolving, but how dependent the mind has been on fixed self-definitions to feel stable. When those definitions weaken, a person often discovers how much of their internal security was built on familiarity rather than truth. The gap makes that visible. It reveals how much effort has gone into preserving continuity, even when continuity no longer matches what awareness has begun to see. This does not make the gap comfortable. In lived experience, it can feel disorienting in very practical ways. You may notice that certain conversations no longer feel natural, but you do not yet know how to speak differently. You may notice that old motivations are weakening, but the new ones are not yet clear. You may feel less able to pretend, less able to perform, less able to move through life on older assumptions, and yet you still do not fully know what is taking their place. That is why this phase often carries a strange mixture of clarity and uncertainty. Some things become unmistakably false, yet the truth that replaces them has not fully stabilized into language or form. This can make a person doubt their own process. They know what no longer fits, but they cannot yet describe with confidence what will fit next. The mind often interprets this as emptiness, but emptiness is not always absence. Sometimes it is the temporary condition created when an old structure has loosened enough for something more honest to begin emerging. This is also why the identity gap can feel lonely, even when nothing external has changed yet. Much of identity is relational. It is reinforced by the roles people expect from you and the ways you have learned to appear recognizable within a social world. When the inner structure begins shifting, you may still be seen the same way from the outside while feeling very different on the inside. That creates tension. You are no longer fully at home in the version of yourself others still assume is stable. The deeper mechanism here is important. Identity depends on repetition. It is strengthened by familiar thoughts, familiar reactions, familiar stories, and familiar emotional loops. When awareness begins interrupting those repetitions, identity starts losing the constant reinforcement that once made it feel obvious. That does not mean the self disappears. It means the pattern version of self is no longer being fed in the same way. The gap is what that interruption feels like before a deeper coherence has formed. You may also notice that time behaves differently in this phase. Because identity normally creates continuity, it gives life a familiar inner rhythm. When identity weakens, that rhythm can become strange. Days may feel less anchored to the person you thought you were. Past versions of yourself may feel both familiar and distant at the same time. Even memory can begin shifting, not because facts disappear, but because the meaning you once attached to them is changing. This changes your relationship to the past in a very important way. Many people assume the identity gap is only about the future, about not knowing who they are becoming. But it is also about the past, because as identity loosens, the mind starts rereading prior experience through a different lens. Moments that once seemed defining may begin looking incomplete. Choices that once felt inevitable may reveal older fears, needs, or assumptions that you could not see at the time. The gap does not only unsettle what comes next, it reinterprets what came before. That reinterpretation can feel destabilizing if you are still demanding a fixed narrative about who you are, but it can also be liberating. Once the old frame weakens, the past stops functioning as a prison of self-definition. Memory remains, but its authority changes. The story you told about your life is no longer the only story available. And when that happens, identity starts becoming less like a rigid conclusion and more like an evolving structure of meaning. This is one reason the identity gap deserves more respect than most people give it. It is not merely a phase of confusion to hurry through. It is a period in which deeper honesty becomes possible because the usual pressures of self-maintenance are no longer working as smoothly. You cannot rely on old definitions as easily, and that very difficulty can create the conditions for real self-recognition. Not the quick recognition that comes from finding another label, but the slower recognition that emerges when the mind stops forcing premature certainty. The challenge, of course, is that most people do not know how to remain inside this process without panicking. They assume that if they cannot clearly define themselves, they are becoming fragmented. Sometimes fragmentation is present, but often what they are actually feeling is the temporary instability that comes when identity is being reorganized at a deeper level. The system has not failed. It is becoming less willing to lie in the old way. That is a very different condition. Once you see that, the question begins to change. It is no longer only why the old self feels unstable, but what kind of stability is actually worth building next. Because not every form of coherence is equally true. Some forms of stability come from narrowing yourself down until you feel easy to explain. Other forms come from allowing more honesty into the structure of the self, even if that honesty takes longer to organize. And once that distinction becomes visible, the identity gap starts revealing that it is not simply a void between selves, but the place where a more real foundation may be deciding what it will and will not carry forward. What makes this phase difficult is not only that the old identity is weakening, it is that the weakening often exposes needs you did not know were holding the structure together. A person may think they are losing a self concept when in reality they are also losing a familiar source of safety, predictability, and inner permission. The old identity was not only descriptive, it was regulatory. It told the system what to expect, how to behave, what role to occupy, and what kind of reality felt manageable. That is why the identity gap can trigger such disproportionate discomfort. The mind is not simply noticing that a description no longer fits. It is realizing that the pattern it used to organize life no longer feels trustworthy in the same way. What most people assume is uncertainty about self is often uncertainty about how to function without the old internal map. And when the map weakens, the mind does what it always does when orientation begins slipping. It starts searching for anything that can restore immediate coherence. This is where the temptation to simplify becomes very strong. A person in transition often wants a clean answer about who they are now, because clean answers calm the nervous system. But the deeper process rarely moves in a clean line. It moves by revealing what can no longer be carried forward honestly, then waiting to see what remains true when the old performances lose momentum. That waiting period is frustrating precisely because it does not provide instant relief. It asks for a different kind of stability than the mind is used to building. Most people do not realize how much of identity is built through repetition under pressure. You learn what version of yourself gets acceptance, what version avoids conflict, what version feels effective, what version seems lovable, and what version allows you to predict the response of the world around you. Over time, those repeated adjustments stop feeling adaptive and start feeling natural. You call that naturalness your personality, your role, your nature, your place. But when awareness deepens, you begin to notice how much of that so called naturalness was shaped by conditions you never consciously chose. That recognition shifts the identity gap from being merely a crisis of self definition into something more revealing. It becomes a confrontation with inherited inner architecture. The question is no longer only who am I now? It becomes what in me was built through truth and what in me was built through adaptation, fear, repetition, and the need to remain legible inside systems that rewarded certain versions of me more than others. That question opens a much deeper layer of honesty because it starts examining not just the content of identity, but the mechanism that built it. You may notice this mechanism in experience when old reactions continue happening even after you no longer agree with them. A pattern arises, you see it clearly, and yet some part of you still moves along the older track. That can feel discouraging if you assume insight should produce immediate change. But this is often what happens when perception moves ahead of conditioning. You are seeing more clearly because the rest of the system is fully reorganized around that new clarity. This matters because many people misread that lag as hypocrisy or failure. They think if I see this pattern, why am I still acting from it? But seeing the pattern is often the beginning of separation from it, not the final proof that it has dissolved. The old identity keeps expressing itself for a time because repetition has weight. It has emotional pathways, relational habits, and bodily expectations built into it. The fact that you can now see it while it is happening means the structure has already begun losing some of its invisibility. That loss of invisibility is one of the most important transitions inside the identity gap. At first, the old self felt like reality. Then it begins to feel like a pattern. Later, it may begin to feel like a strategy. And eventually, if the process continues honestly enough, it may begin to look like something you once had to become in order to survive, function, belong, or feel coherent. Each of those shifts changes your relationship to yourself. The pattern is not merely weakening, it is being reclassified in the light of deeper awareness. This is also why compassion becomes more important here than judgment. When the old structure begins revealing itself as adaptation, the mind may want to attack it for being false. But attacking the structure usually keeps you trapped in the same old relationship to self that created it. A more honest approach is to understand it, not excuse everything it produced, but understand the intelligence inside it. Every identity pattern, even the limiting ones, was trying to solve a problem at some point. The gap becomes less chaotic when you recognize that what is dissolving once served a function, even if that function no longer deserves control. That perspective changes the experience of inner instability. The weakening of the old self no longer has to be interpreted as pure collapse. It can also be seen as the loosening of strategies that became too small for what awareness is now able to hold. This does not make the process easy, but it makes it more precise. You're not simply watching yourself fall apart. You're watching certain forms of coherence lose authority because they were built around older conditions that no longer fully define your inner world. As this becomes visible, another pressure often emerges beneath the surface. If the old identity was maintained through familiar responses, then the gap creates moments where you no longer know how to respond in the old way, but cannot yet respond from the new one with confidence. This creates pauses in places where there used to be reflex. You may notice it in relationships, in work, in private thought, in the stories you tell about your life. The old answer does not come as easily, and the new answer is not yet stable enough to arrive with force. Those pauses are not meaningless. They are often the first lived experience that change is actually occurring. Reflex is being interrupted, automatic identification is slowing down. The system is no longer able to move with the same unconscious smoothness through patterns that once felt inevitable. That can feel awkward in the moment, but awkwardness is not always regression. Sometimes awkwardness is what honesty feels like before it becomes fluent. This is one reason the identity gap can make a person seem less certain, less polished, or less immediately defined than before. The old version may have looked more coherent because it was more practiced. The emerging version may look quieter, less fixed, and more provisional because it is not being driven by the same need to perform stability. From the outside, that can be misunderstood as weakness. From the inside, it may actually be the beginning of a more truthful alignment, one that is still learning how to stand without leaning on familiar exaggerations of self. And this raises a deeper question about what kind of identity deserves to survive the transition at all. If an identity is built largely through performance, repetition, and adaptation, then its collapse is not the whole story. The real question is what remains when a person is no longer trying so hard to be recognizable in the old way. What form of self can emerge when awareness stops organizing itself around old permissions, old fears, and old bargains with belonging? The identity gap matters because it clears enough space for that question to finally become real. Many people try to answer that question too quickly. They want the next self to arrive as a finished concept, neat and stable, preferably with language that makes the uncertainty disappear. But what often emerges first is not a finished identity. It is a quieter relationship to self. Less performance, less compulsion to explain everything immediately, less urgency to force coherence before it is honestly formed. The quieter relationship can feel fragile at first, but fragility is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the early condition of something more real than what came before. You may also notice that as the gap continues, your standards begin changing. Not just your standards for other people or for the world, but your standards for what counts as inward truth. Things you once accepted from yourself because they were familiar may stop feeling sufficient. Explanations that once sounded deep may begin sounding rehearsed. Emotional habits that once felt like your nature may reveal themselves as older conditioning. The deeper self is not merely forming a new image, it is becoming less willing to live inside false resolution. That is why the identity gap is not only about losing certainty, it is about refining discernment. You begin distinguishing between what is merely familiar and what is actually true. You begin seeing the difference between a self-definition that stabilizes you quickly and one that reflects what awareness has genuinely grown into. And once you begin feeling that difference, the gap no longer appears as an empty interval between identities. It starts to look like a filtering space, a place where certain versions of self are being tested for whether they can still carry the weight of deeper seeing. This is where the process begins turning from instability into selection. Not selection in the shallow sense of choosing a new label, but in the deeper sense of discovering what the system can no longer pretend not to know about itself. The gap keeps revealing what collapses under honest attention and what quietly remains. And once that distinction becomes strong enough, a different kind of foundation starts becoming possible. One that is not built first on being certain who you are, but on becoming unwilling to build yourself out of what you now know is no longer true. Eventually, the identity gap begins teaching something that the earlier instability could not yet reveal. It shows that coherence and certainty are not the same thing. For much of life, people confuse the two. They think if they can describe themselves clearly enough, defend that description strongly enough, and repeat it consistently enough, then they have become coherent. But coherence built on repetition is not always the same as coherence built on truth. The gap exposes that difference because it removes the comfort of old certainty before deeper coherence has fully taken shape. That removal is not random. It happens because the system is beginning to reject forms of selfhood that require too much distortion to maintain. At first, the loss feels personal. It can feel as though something reliable is being taken away. But over time, another perspective becomes available. What is being removed is not always your deepest self. Very often, it is your former agreement to organize yourself around what no longer deserves central authority. This is why the identity gap can eventually feel cleaner than it felt at the beginning. Not easier necessarily, but cleaner. In the earlier stages, there is often confusion because the old structure is still close enough to imitate, defend, or temporarily restore. But as the process continues, certain options begin losing their appeal entirely. The self-definitions that once seemed necessary start looking expensive. They require too much performance, too much compression, too much betrayal of what awareness has already seen. You may notice that this changes the kind of struggle you are having. At first, the struggle is often about not knowing who you are. Later, the struggle becomes more precise. You begin knowing more clearly what you can no longer return to, even if you still cannot fully articulate what is emerging instead. That is a real form of movement. It may not look like arrival, but it is already a form of selection. The field is narrowing, not around a new label, but around greater honesty. That honesty often reveals something important about the structure of identity itself. The self is not only built through what you claim, it is also built through what you repeatedly tolerate. You become organized around what you excuse, what you rehearse, what you fear losing, and what you keep calling necessary long after it has stopped being true. When the gap deepens, those tolerated falsehoods start feeling heavier. What once felt manageable becomes feeling misaligned. This is one reason the old identity becomes harder to sustain even before the new one becomes clear. That shift has practical consequences. A person may become less willing to force enthusiasm for what no longer fits, less willing to pretend clarity where there is still process, less willing to answer every question about themselves in a way that keeps others comfortable. From the outside, that may look like hesitation or inconsistency. From the inside, it may be the first real refusal to build certainty out of what no longer feels alive. That refusal matters because it protects the emerging self from being forced into premature form. Most people do not realize how much damage comes from premature form. They assume any answer is better than uncertainty. But some answers arrive too early and harden around fear. They stop the deeper process by giving the mind something neat enough to cling to. This is why the identity gap sometimes needs more time than the impatient mind prefers. It is not merely trying to replace one story with another. It is testing whether the next foundation can bear more truth than the last one could. That testing happens in experience, not just in thought. You see it in the moments when a new possibility appears and you feel both drawn to it and cautious of naming it too quickly. You see it when you stop over-explaining yourself and allow something to remain unfinished a little longer. You see it when you sense that a new form of coherence is possible, but only if you stop trying to make it appear complete before it has matured. The system is learning restraint, not fear-based restraint, but the kind that allows something real to grow without forcing it to perform before it is rooted. This also changes the meaning of instability. Earlier in the process, instability may have felt like danger. Later, it can begin to feel like openness. Not infinite openness, not shapelessness for its own sake, but a more disciplined openness that refuses to close around the wrong center. The gap becomes less like falling and more like waiting inside a structure or clearing. You begin to sense that certain old supports had to leave, not because you were meant to become empty, but because you were meant to stop balancing your life on foundations that depended on partial truth. That is where a deeper confidence can begin forming, even before a final self-description appears. Not the confidence of knowing exactly who you are in every word, the confidence of becoming less available to false arrangement, the confidence of feeling the difference between what stabilizes you temporarily and what aligns you more deeply. This kind of confidence is quieter than the old kind. It does not announce itself as certainty nearly as fast, but it has more integrity because it is not built first on image. It is built on increasing unwillingness to organize yourself around what awareness has already outgrown. You may notice that this changes your relationship to recognition as well. Earlier, identity may have depended heavily on being seen a certain way, by others or even by yourself. The gap weakens that dependency because it reveals how unstable recognition can be when it is built on outdated structure. What people recognize in you may lag behind what is actually changing. What you recognize in yourself may also lag, because language and self-image often update more slowly than awareness. This creates a strange but important freedom. You become less dependent on immediate recognition as proof of what is real. That freedom matters because it allows a new selfhood to begin forming from inward truth rather than external legibility. The old identity often needed to be understandable quickly. It needed to explain itself, justify itself, and remain narratively coherent even when that coherence came at the cost of compression. The emerging identity may move differently. It may be less interested in being immediately legible and more interested in being internally honest. That honesty can look slower, quieter, and less dramatic, but it is often a stronger basis for long-term coherence. This is one reason the identity gap should not be mistaken for the absence of self. It is often the place where selfhood is being relieved of what it never should have had to carry. Old scripts, old loyalties, old performances, old bargains with belonging, old compulsions to stay recognizable at the cost of truth. As those burdens loosen, the emerging structure may feel sparse for a while, but sparseness is not the same as deficiency. Sometimes it is what remains when excess arrangement has finally begun falling away. And when enough of that excess falls away, another shift becomes possible. You stop asking only who am I, and begin asking from what am I willing to live. That question is deeper because it is not merely descriptive. It is architectural. It asks what principles, what forms of honesty, What level of inward truth can actually hold a life together without requiring the same distortion as before? This is where the identity gap begins turning into foundation work. The process is no longer just about loss. It is about what kind of life can be built when the self is no longer arranged primarily around fear, repetition, and inherited necessity. That does not mean all uncertainty disappears. Real transformation is rarely that neat. Even as something truer begins to form, there may still be moments of hesitation, moments of softness, moments where the mind wants clearer edges than the process can honestly provide. But by this point, the relationship to uncertainty has changed. It is no longer automatically treated as proof that nothing is forming. It can now be recognized as part of the conditions under which deeper coherence becomes possible. This is where the identity gap reveals its final intelligence. It does not only strip away what no longer fits, it teaches the system how to stop worshiping premature closure. It teaches a person how to remain near what is real before it becomes easy to explain. It teaches the difference between stabilizing around an answer and stabilizing around a deeper standard of truth. And once that difference is felt strongly enough, the question of who you are starts becoming inseparable from another question that reaches even further into the structure of becoming.
Mission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.